Hello and welcome back. Welcome to a new edition of Vaughan en Vivo, just you and me together, a private class. A mí me gustan las clases individuales, where it's just you and me, no other students. You don't have to share my time with other students, and you don't have to listen to other students mal hablar inglés, make mistakes with the English language. So it's just you and me, and everything I say will be correct English. So simply relax, take it easy, but don't leave. Stay where you are. You don't have to concentrate. In fact, I prefer you not to concentrate. I prefer that you sit down, relax, and simply enjoy this class. Okay? In one of my other classes, I spent one block of 25 minutes, one segment, talking about the conditionals, what I call the present conditional. I teach because I need money. If I didn't need money, I wouldn't teach. I drink water because I'm a human being, or that I'm an organic being. If I weren't an organic being, I wouldn't need to drink water. I wear a watch because I need to know the time. If I didn't need to know the time, I wouldn't wear a watch. I'm sitting because I'm not standing. If I were standing, I wouldn't be sitting. The earth is round because it's not flat. If the earth were flat, like this table, it wouldn't be round. Okay? I have 10 fingers because I don't have 15. If I had 15 fingers, I wouldn't have 10. Esto es el condicional del presente, lo que tengo ahora mismo. Si no lo tuvieras, no soy rico. Por eso no tengo una mansión en Las Vegas, pero si fuera rico, tendría una mansión en Las Vegas, tal vez. No tengo yate en Barbados, porque no soy rico, pero si fuera rico, if I were rich, I would have a yacht in Barbados, in the Virgin Islands, okay, or in the Caribbean. If I were rich, but I'm not. Yes, I am married because I love my wife. If I didn't love my wife, I wouldn't be married. Estoy casado con mi mujer porque la quiero. Si no la quisiese, no estaría casado con ella, etc. I live with my wife because I love her. If I didn't love her, maybe I wouldn't live with her, etc. Okay? Presente condicional. Ahora vamos al pasado condicional. I came to Spain many years ago because I wanted to improve my Spanish. If I hadn't wanted to improve my Spanish, I wouldn't have come to Spain. Adolf Hitler lost the Second World War because he invaded the Soviet Union. If he hadn't invaded the Soviet Union, probably he would have lost the war anyway, but maybe 5 years later. It would have taken a lot more time to defeat Hitler if he hadn't invaded Russia or the Soviet Union. Okay? I came here today because I had to give this class. If I hadn't had to give this class, I wouldn't have come here today. All right? I bought a car 3 years ago because my old car was broken. If my old car hadn't been broken, I wouldn't have bought a new car 3 years ago. All right? The makeup artist put makeup on my face 20 minutes ago because I needed to start this program. If I hadn't needed to start this program, the makeup artist wouldn't have put makeup on my face. Okay? I got married in Spain because my wife was Spanish. If my wife had been French, I would have gotten married in France. Okay? I brought this pen to class earlier because I needed to use it. If I hadn't needed to use the pen, I wouldn't have brought it to class. Okay? The United States broke from England 200 years ago because they wanted to be independent. If the United States hadn't wanted to be independent, it wouldn't have broken from the United Kingdom, or at that time from Great Britain. All right? France became very powerful in the early 19th century because Napoleon was their leader. If Napoleon hadn't been their leader at that time, France wouldn't have been so powerful, probably. Napoleon lost the battle in Waterloo because he wasn't a good strategist on that day. If he had been a good strategist on that day, he might have won the Battle of Waterloo. Ferdinand and Isabella got married because they wanted to unite Spain. They wanted to unite the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. If they hadn't wanted to unite the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, they wouldn't have gotten married, probably. Okay? And Ferdinand died after Isabel because Isabella died relatively young. If Isabella hadn't died relatively young, Ferdinand wouldn't have lived longer. Okay? And the United States became independent because it wanted to be self-reliant. If the United States hadn't wanted to be self-reliant, it wouldn't have become independent. I became an English teacher because I wanted to start earning money in Spain. If I hadn't wanted or hadn't needed to start earning money in Spain, I wouldn't have become an English teacher initially. When I came to Spain, my second time, I needed to start working. I arrived in this country with only $300. I remember I was in Dallas, Texas. I finished my studies. I drove my car from Dallas to Atlanta, Georgia. Okay? It's 3 days. All right? And my sister was living in Atlanta. That's why I went to Atlanta. That's why I went to Atlanta. If my sister hadn't been in Atlanta, I wouldn't have driven from Dallas to Atlanta. You understand? If she hadn't been in Atlanta, I wouldn't have had, no habría tenido ninguna razón, ningún motivo. I wouldn't have had any reason to go to Atlanta. But because she lived in Atlanta, I drove from Dallas to Atlanta. And it took me 3 days, not 2, because I decided to spend half a day in a certain town in Mississippi. Okay? If I hadn't stopped in that town in Mississippi, it would have taken me 2 days to go to Atlanta, probably, rather than 3, because the distance from Dallas to Atlanta is 2 full days, 10 hours, maybe 20 hours by car, 18 to 20 hours by car. So I could have traveled, I could have driven from Dallas to Atlanta in 2 days, but I didn't, because I decided to stop in Mississippi. And if I hadn't decided to stop in Mississippi, I would have reached Atlanta in 2 days. Now, my sister was in Atlanta at that time. If she hadn't been in Atlanta, I wouldn't have driven there. I would have come to Spain directly from Dallas and not from Atlanta. Now, my sister was living in Atlanta, not because she wanted necessarily to live in Atlanta. It was because her husband was studying dentistry, odontología. My brother-in-law, or her husband, was studying dentistry at a university in Atlanta. Now, if her husband hadn't been studying dentistry in Atlanta, my sister wouldn't have been there. And so if he, my brother-in-law, hadn't been studying dentistry, I wouldn't have driven to Atlanta. Okay? But I drove to Atlanta, and I spent 4 days with my sister. And during those 4 days, I sold my car. Why did I sell my car? Well, it's very simple. What was I going to do with my car if I was coming to Spain? I was planning to come to Spain. And I made the decision in Dallas to drive from Dallas to Atlanta to pay a visit to my sister and then to catch a flight from Atlanta, which is Atlanta, New York, London. Okay, London. Now, if my sister hadn't been in Atlanta, I wouldn't have decided on that itinerary. I would have changed my itinerary. Estoy siempre hablando en el pasado condicional, o el condicional del pasado. Si mi hermano no hubiera estado en aquel entonces en Atlanta, yo habría cambiado mi itinerario. I would have changed. I would have changed my itinerary. But I decided to go to Atlanta. And I spent 4 days in Atlanta. And while I was there, I sold my car. Now, I wouldn't have sold my car if I hadn't been planning to come to Spain. I wouldn't have sold my car. It was a good car, and it was only 3 years old, yeah. But I sold it, yeah. I sold it on the last day. If I hadn't been planning, si no hubiera estado planeando, si no hubiera sido mi plan, if I hadn't been planning to come to Spain, I wouldn't have sold my car in Atlanta, all right? But I sold it, and I sold it on the last day. I would have preferred to sell it on the second day or the third day, but I couldn't. When I got to Atlanta on the first day, I placed a classified ad in the newspaper. To place is colocar. Colocamos anuncios igual que vosotros. I placed a classified ad. AD se escribe. Ad es un anuncio. Classified means por palabras. Un anuncio por palabras. I placed a classified ad the first day I got to Atlanta from my sister's house. I called the local newspaper that everybody reads, and I placed a classified ad offering my car for sale for $900. $900, okay? And nobody called on the second day. So I decided to wait, and nobody called on the third day, okay? So apparently nobody was interested in my car. On the fourth day, which was my last full day in Atlanta, I decided to take the car to a dealership. I decided to take the car to a dealership. A dealership es una concesión, un concesionario. And I sold the car to the used car department of the dealership, and they paid me $650. So I lost a potential $250, okay? Now, if somebody had called me the day before to buy the car, I wouldn't have taken my car to the dealership. If somebody had offered $900, I would have sold it to that person. Even if somebody had offered me $800, I probably would have said yes, and I would have sold the car to the person. But nobody called. And so I took the car to the dealership, and I sold it. And I remember it was the last full day. The following morning, I needed to catch a flight to come to Europe. If I hadn't needed to catch a flight the next day, I would have continued trying to sell the car through the newspaper. But I had to come to Europe the following day, so I had to make a decision. So late in the morning, around 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, I drove the car to a dealership. I drove to the used car department, and I walked in, I introduced myself, I explained to the man, the manager, el gerente, the manager of the used cars, that I wanted to sell that car. Now, I wouldn't have done this if I had sold the car the day before. But I needed to leave Atlanta the next day, so I had to make a decision. And he got up and went out and checked the car. He got in, he sat down in the driver's seat, he looked at the speedometer to check the mileage, odometro, and he looked at the tapestry of the car, tapiceria. He looked at the interior. And then he went out and he walked around. He looked under the back of the car, checking to see if the car had had an accident. He was an expert. And he said to me, "Do you mind if I drive it around the block a few times?" I said, "Well, no." Now, if he hadn't been interested in the car initially, he wouldn't have asked me. He wouldn't have asked me if he could drive it. Okay? But he was initially interested in the car. So he drove it around a few times. And when he came back, he said, "I'll give you $650. I'll give you $650. Okay? If he had offered me $300, I wouldn't have sold it. If he had offered $400, I wouldn't have sold it. If he had offered me $500, I would have thought about it. And I probably would have said yes. If he had offered $600, I would have said yes without thinking about it. But he offered me $650, so I said yes. ¿Os estáis fijando en las estructuras aquí? No voy a entrar demasiado en la mecánica de la estructura. Cualquier libro de gramática puede indicaros la estructura. Estoy tratando que de forma fluida bañaros el oído con esta estructura para que se os vaya quedando un poquito. Okay, if he had offered me si me hubiera ofrecido, if he had offered me $300, I would have rejected the offer. If he had offered me $400, I would have turned down, que es lo mismo que rejected, the offer. If he had offered me $500, I would have had a dilemma. I wouldn't have known what to say, yes or no. So I would have thought about it for a few minutes. If he had offered me $600, I would have accepted it immediately. But he offered me $650, $250 less than what I wanted through my newspaper ad. So I said yes. So I sold my car en el acto y en el lugar. Se dice en este caso, on the spot. On the spot. Como una mancha en la camisa, a spot. Okay? Un quita manchas is a spot remover. So I accepted the offer on the spot. He paid me cash, I remember. I needed to sign some papers transferring the ownership to the dealership, al concesionario, transferring the ownership of the car to the dealership. And it was interesting. I didn't need to fill out any official documents with a notary or similar. And he opened a drawer, took out money, 1, 2, 3, and he paid me $650 in cash. Metálico frío, decimos, it's cold cash. I pocketed it, lo embolsé, and then I went back to my sister's house by taxi, okay, which cost about $10. So really, the transaction for me was not $650, it was $640. And when I got back to my sister's house, she said, a man just came and wanted to buy the car. And he said he was willing to pay $900. He was willing to pay. He was willing to pay. Estaba dispuesto a pagar los $900 que yo pedía. And during the time I was at the dealership receiving $650, another man was at my sister's house willing to pay $900. And it was too late. I had already sold the car and signed the papers. So there was nothing I could do. And my sister apologized to the man. And so if I had waited 1 hour to go to the dealership, that hour would have been worth $250. If I hadn't been worried about not selling the car, I would have earned more money. If I had waited until the early afternoon, if I had waited until the early afternoon to sell the car or to take the car to the dealership, I would have been able to make a deal with the man, and I would have earned $900. But in any case, I had $650. I didn't have a car. The next morning, my sister took me to the airport because she didn't have a job. Well, she had a job, but it was a part-time job. If she had had a full-time job, she wouldn't have been able to take me to the airport. But she took me to the airport. Yes, she took me to the airport. And I came to Europe, not to Spain yet, because I flew to London via New York City, Kennedy Airport. I flew from Atlanta to New York, from New York to London. Okay. I wouldn't have flown through New York if there had been a direct flight from Atlanta to London. But at that time, in 1974, al parecer, apparently, there wasn't a direct flight or from Atlanta to London. So I routed my flight through New York. Enrouté. I routed my flight through New York. If there had been a direct flight from Atlanta to London, I wouldn't have routed my flight through New York. I would have taken the direct flight, even if it had cost a little bit more, even if it had cost 10% or 20% more, because I don't like stopovers, okay? But I went to London, and my sister took me to the airport that morning in Atlanta. I said goodbye and I left, yeah. My sister took me to the airport. If she had had a full-time job, she wouldn't have been able to take me to the airport. She wouldn't have been able to take me to the airport, and I would have had to catch a taxi. And it would have cost about $30 or $40 at that time, which is a lot of money. If she hadn't been able to take me to the airport, I would have had to take a taxi. If she hadn't, si no hubiera podido llevarme al aeropuerto, yo habría tenido que coger un taxi. It sounds difficult in English. If she hadn't been able to take me to the airport, I would have had to take a taxi or to catch a taxi. If she hadn't been able, ese had, or en este caso hadn't, es negativo, eso nunca cambia después de if. Si tuviera dos bolis, if I had, bueno, si hubiera tenido ayer dos bolis, if I had, si este micrófono no hubiera funcionado, if this microphone hadn't worked, si me hubieran dado más agua, if they had given me more water, si hubiera sabido que no ibas a estar, if I had known, if I had, if you had, if they had, si hubieran comido, si hubieran ido, si hubieran venido, si hubieran sabido, si hubieran, si hubieran, it's the same in Spanish. In Spanish you can say si hubieran sabido, si hubiesen, but in English, had. If they had, if I had known, if you had known, si hubiera sabido, if they had known, si no hubieran sabido, if they hadn't known. Okay, en el caso de mi hermana, si no hubiera podido, if she hadn't been able to take me to the airport in her car, I would have tenido que coger un taxi. I would have had to catch a cab, to catch a taxi, all right, if I hadn't been able to go to the airport with my sister. And I came to Europe, but first I went to London. If I hadn't made the decision to go to London, I probably would have come directly to Madrid. If I hadn't made the decision to go to London, but I wanted to spend a couple of weeks in London because I like London. It was my third time. Yeah, that flight to London was my third time to London, okay? It was my third time. But if I hadn't made the decision to go to London, I probably would have come straight to Madrid from Atlanta. Okay. Takes forever to learn the conditional. I could continue forever on this class on the conditional, but we need to take a break. It's time to take a break. So I'll be back in 5 minutes, okay? See you.